This is one that I've covered in the past, but it's a great topic, and so I'm going to do it again. And this is evolution and the eye. Some of you know that I came from an atheist perspective. I was an atheist for many, many years, although I'd been raised in a Christian home. And I believed all that stuff, and I had all sorts of atheist arguments to use against Christians. But the day came when I realized those were foolish and that there really was a God. And that changed my whole perspective on life. And once that perspective changes, suddenly you see things in very different ways. And right now, people who believe like that, atheists and evolutionists and all those others, they have blinders on. They really don't want to see God in anything, even though God is shouting to them from creation, "Here I am, look at what I've done. How can you explain it any other way?" And they find, or they try to find, other ways that they can explain it. But when you really look at it, their explanations are faulty. And that's not just true of evolution. It's the Big Bang Theory, all of those things. They are all having trouble right now because, for example, the Big Bang Theory, science has now progressed enough that they can see that there are problems with the Big Bang Theory that mean it cannot work. And they've tried to adjust that theory a couple times for some of the problems, but there's just a whole bunch of things that say the predictions of evolution and the predictions of the Big Bang Theory are all provably false. And so those theories have real big problems at this time. So anyway, but we're talking about evolution this time. And a little bit of history on evolution. I think most people know that it came from a guy called Darwin. And it came from him at a time when science didn't understand hardly anything about genetics. They had this idea that your child was actually a kind of a sample of you at the moment of the child's birth. And so he was kind of like a mini me. And we understand from genetics now that it's not that way because the genes that you pass on are the genes that you had from birth. You haven't changed in your genes. And so Darwin believed that somehow your life experiences would be able to be passed down to your children. And so right away, Darwinism ran into a trouble as soon as Francis and Crick realized how genetics worked. And so Darwinism had to change, and it changed into what's called neo-Darwinism. And the idea behind that is that random errors occur in our genes. And that's true. We know that does happen. There are all sorts of processes that can go wrong in the gene. It's extremely complicated. And there definitely are random errors in the genes. And continuing on with that, neo-Darwinism says that sometimes these random errors can have a reproductive benefit. Well, science has never seen that happen. What we always see is these random errors either do nothing good or they do something seriously bad to the organism. It has a deficit. It doesn't get something brand new, some new skill, some new appendage, and nothing like that good. These random errors always result in either nothing happening or else the person is susceptible to disease or is weak or is crippled or something else has gone wrong. And so there aren't any examples that have ever been seen. But they still believe that despite that, somehow there is, over a period of time, the possibility that there could be a reproductive benefit that would be carried on. And so the third part of that idea is that benefit causes the beneficial change to spread through a population and become something that everybody has in a population. And population dynamics don't actually work that way in a lot of cases, especially in small populations. But nonetheless, that is the basis for neo-Darwinism, the idea that there can be random errors in genes that can sometimes have reproductive benefits that are passed on to the entire population. But there's a lot of big problems with that. And the eye is one of those complex structures that argues against that, and I'll explain why in just a moment here. Complex structures are problematic because you don't get that reproductive benefit. You don't get something that is a blessing you can pass on to your children until the whole complex structure is in place. If you don't have the whole thing, if you're missing a part of it, it doesn't have its function, and therefore there's no benefit to it. And so why would that ever become something you would pass on to your children? Well, it doesn't make any sense. The other problem is the waiting time problem, as it's called, and that is the idea that you need to wait millions of years for these things to happen. And that's a big part of what evolution is all about, is the only way they can make these ideas work is they need millions of years randomness, random errors, and sometimes all of these random errors coming together to be a beneficial change in the organism, something that can be passed on and be of benefit. The other problem is what's called the geologic column. And that is when you look at the earth and you dig down in the earth, you see the bones of animals and in different forms. And you can see when you look at that geologic column is that what Darwinism predicts isn't seen in the column. You don't see the evidence of intermediate forms. So in the case of the eye that we're going to be looking at here, you should see simple, incomplete eyes that on some animals that aren't functional yet, but they're still there. But you don't see that, and you don't see any of these intermediate forms that you would expect to see if Darwinism is right. You should see all of the steps from when it was something that was in the ocean and then began to walk on land. You should be able to find all those intermediate forms in the geologic column, but you don't find that. What you always find is fully formed things, and you find eyes particularly in all sorts of animals, very small animals and very large animals in the geologic column, but you never see them non-functional. They are always plainly up front of the animal and there to do their job of seeing. So those three things really argue strongly against evolution, and they are really big problems. And in truth right now, there are very few people among scientists who believe in evolution. But that doesn't mean that they accept God. They just mean that they need a new theory, and they're sure it isn't the God theory. They're sure that there must be some other theory that's going to explain all of this stuff, but they don't have that theory yet. So looking at the eye in particular, the eye is an amazing organism, and we take it so for granted, but it's so critical to our lives. Imagine losing your eye and what changes that would cause in your life. And so the eye, I hope you can see this picture. It's not that great on my screen. The eye has a number of pieces in it that have to be there for it to be a functional eye. And you'd be kind of surprised at how much of that. It needs to have the cornea, which is the lens cap on the outside. And the cornea is actually going to be important. I'll explain that in a moment in more detail. But it's a rare piece on the body. It's a piece of skin that is transparent. So what you have to form a cornea it turns out the cornea structure is very complicated so that it can be transparent. And so it's not something that is easily created by the body. It's a very complex structure in itself for a transparent skin to exist. And so it's difficult to accept that transparent skin could even form, and let alone all the other pieces that we're going to talk about here. And so the cornea is critical to that minimal eye you have to have for it to be something that gives a benefit to the organism that it's in. The other thing you have to have is an iris, and the iris gives you control of light. And so if we didn't have an iris, we would be blinded by bright lights on sunny days, and we would be completely in the dark on nights. And so the iris gives us that ability to control the amount of light that's coming in so that we can see in brightness and we can see in darkness. Otherwise, we really would only be limited to a small range of brightnesses in our environment. So it's critical for us to have an ability to gain a benefit from the eye. The other piece that you have to have is the lens, and the lens does image focusing just like any other kind of lens, but it's another transparent organism that the body has crafted for this. And its shape, just like the shape of the cornea, is very critical. If you don't have that right, you are blind. The image doesn't form at the back of the eye and isn't seen by the brain. And we suffer from glasses, the need for glasses, and we also have different kinds of problems with the eyes sometimes. But if you didn't have the lens, you wouldn't be able to see anything at all. It wouldn't be possible to gain any benefit from having an eye. So the lens takes the light outside and focuses it on the back of the eye, which is where the retina is. And the retina is a organ made out of a whole bunch of little rods and things that are sensitive to light. And each one of those creates a little signal with the light that's built onto it. And there are a bazillion of those roughly. And those all come together, and there's a little bit of computation that's done right there at the eye. And the signal is simplified some, but it's still millions of signals going to the brain and along the optic nerve. And they travel from the retina to the brain over this optic nerve. And the brain does the most amazing thing. It does image analysis. And that's something that we're just beginning to be able to do reasonably well with computers. But the brain has been doing it for a long time and doing it very well, much better in fact. So without all of these pieces that I just described there are other pieces of the eye that aren't critical to having a functional eye that gives you a benefit. But these things that I've mentioned, these 6 things of the minimal eye, are things that you have to have before the eye gives you any reproductive benefit. And so the problem with this is that a large number of new genes are required for an eye. You need to have a lot of change in the genetic system to go from not having an eye to having an eye. And so that makes it almost impossible for these things to happen. You need to have not just millions or billions of years, you need to have trillions of years to have any possibility for these kind of things to form by themselves. And so it just doesn't make any sense, and certainly there isn't enough time. No one has ever thought that the universe is that old that could have happened, and certainly not life on Earth being that old. Life on Earth is generally considered by those people to be somewhere in the billion-year range, and so there just isn't time to have produced all of this. And the eye is no exception here. The eye is an organ we can look at that is quite complicated and different from other parts of the body. But everything in the body is that way. These things are all purposely done, and they are the way they are to serve purposes that sometimes even scientists don't understand what the purpose is. But they are all crafted for God's reasons. So I mentioned the cornea and the idea of transparency, and I have a couple quotes here from a scientific manual that was talking about that topic of the cornea and how it's transparent. And it says, the basic principles of corneal structure and transparency have been known for some time, but in recent years, X-ray scattering and other methods have revealed that the details of this structure are far more complex than previously thought. So even though they understood that the cornea was a complicated structure to get that transparency, now that they can analyze it better, they're understanding that it's even more complex than they ever thought. And so that complexity gives a problem, because complexity is something that takes time, and there isn't enough time to create something that's complex. So the 2/3 of the eye's focusing is done by the cornea. That's its job. It and the lens work together. The cornea is a fixed magnification lens, and the lens inside of the eye that's just below the cornea is an adjustable lens, so that you can focus near and far. And that's where we get our bad eyesight from, is if that organ can't move enough, can't change enough, or isn't working exactly the way it's supposed to. So both the cornea and the lens in the eye do that focusing function. But 2/3 of the eye's focusing is done from that cornea, which is that transparent skin. Another quote from that same book that I was reading is, in most mammals, the cornea is the only tissue requiring considerable tensile strength, coupled with a perfectly defined shape and optical clarity. So the cornea is unique in that way, in that it needs to be strong and it needs to have an exact shape. Without that lens-like shape, it doesn't do its job of focusing light. And it also needs to be optically clear, or it needs to be transparent. And so, again, the necessary complexity to have something that focuses and works like that is a problem, because you just don't have the time to create that from random changes. So, a few summary comments here. The eye and Darwinism. There's no reproductive value unless all the key pieces are present, and that's really a big problem here. How do you randomly get all of these key pieces to come together so that you can have vision focused in the eye, on the retina, signals going to the brain, and the brain is able to process it into images and understand it? There's not enough time for that to happen, not even for one of those pieces to happen. The time that people think, scientists claim that the Earth has been around, doesn't even give them close to that time. And also, as I mentioned before, there are no intermediate forms in the geologic record that show partial eyes or anything that's like that. This is all the imagination of scientists saying, well, it must have happened this way, and we just haven't seen those. In fact, that was something that Darwin said early on, is that he knew there were problems with his theory that were already things that you couldn't find in the geologic record. But nonetheless, he proposed this theory because it made some sense to him. So, having talked about human eyes, and the complexity of those, I want to talk about different kinds of eyes in all sorts of animals, and there are many different kinds of eyes. Some eyes have only rods. In our eyes, we have what are called rods and cones, and the rods are sensitive to just light, not black and white, we would call that. The cones are the ones that are sensitive to color. So some cones are sensitive to red, some to green, some to blue. And that's how we see color, is because of that. But there are lots of different variations in other animal eyes. Some of them only see in black and white, and they get an increased acuity. They can see things much clearer because of that, because you can put a whole lot more rods into a retina than cones. The cones are much bigger. They use up more space, but they give you color. And so if you sacrifice color and you only see in black and white, you can see much sharper. And many animals, especially night hunting animals, don't have color vision. But there are animals that some have 4 cones, 4 different colors they're sensitive to. And some of those cones let them see into ranges of light that we can't see with our eyes at all. And so some of them have an advantage that way. So some of them can see in as many as 4 colors. Some of them see only in 2 colors. And as I mentioned before, some only see in 1 color. And so eyes among all these animals are really very different. And again, that goes to our complexity problem, is how do you explain all of these different kinds of eyes if they all developed in different ways? So some eyes, and cat's eyes are one of these, they have a reflective surface that's behind the retina. And so the light goes down into the rods and the cones and is reflected back into the rods and cones. And so it's basically, if it wasn't caught by the rod or cone and the signal created for the eye, it bounces back and goes through again and gets a chance to be caught again and a signal to be found and sent to the brain from it. So basically, animals like cats get the light reflected again, so they get basically 2 passes at it. And that gives them night vision that we don't have. They can see much better in the night because their eyes are built differently. But again, this is a complexity. How did this reflective thing happen to be between the retina on animals who need that and not on humans, for example? And so you've got an eye that is somehow developed differently because of that. Some eyes have neurons in the back, so the sensor is at the back of the cone, and others have it at the front of the cone. And there's actually some benefits associated with that for certain kinds of animals. And we have the sensor in the back, no, in the front, sorry, in the front. And so the light goes into the cone or the rod and creates an electrical signal, but the pickup for that electrical signal is at the front of the rod or the cone, not at the back of the rod or the cone. And so that means that we have to have cells that at the front of the eye, in front of the retina, that are sort of blocking the light in the retina, and those cells pick up the signals, they do some basic processing on it, and then they have to pipe those signals along the retina out to where they go down to the brain. There's kind of a hole in your vision, which is your blank spot, and that's where all of the signal wires coming from all of the cones and rods are going down and heading off to the brain. So because of that difference, we have a bit of a blank spot in our vision, but it turns out to be better for humans to have that kind of vision, but other animals have that pickup at the back instead. So that is a structurally big difference between the eyes in how they work and where the processing is. Some animals have multiple eyes. You're probably aware of that. And as far as I know, they're always in pairs. I don't know of animals that have a single eye, a monocular kind of eye. And so they all have some stereo vision, but some animals have as many as 12 eyes. And some of these eyes are compound eyes, which means that they have a whole bunch of lenses. They're basically a whole bunch of very, very simple eyes all in a cluster. And that picture there shows you that idea. You can see all of those little lenses there, and each one of those lenses goes to its own little retina, a very simple retina, and the retina has signals. And this is a fly, I believe, on this particular picture. And so the reason that's good for a fly is that a fly can see motion all around him, from well in the back until forward. And because of those simple compound eyes, anything that moves is really accentuated. Every eye sees the movement. And so if you try to swing at a fly, the fly sees that coming well in advance, and that makes it hard for us to hit flies. So that's a very big difference in eyes. Compound eyes are not at all like the eyes that we have. And some animals actually have a mixture of that. Some of them have simple eyes like we do, and some of them have compound eyes, both of those, and they get the benefits from both of those. And so scientists have looked at this and said, how did all of these different eyes come to exist? How is it possible? And the only answer they can come up with is that there had to be separate evolutions for all these different kinds of eyes. And that makes it even harder now. Now you've not only increased complexity, but you've required multiple evolutions of eyes. And so that is, again, even less likely than it was before to have a single kind of eye evolve. So these are all problems that are really big problems for evolutionists. And this is just the eye. As I said, the body is complicated in many other ways. And so separate evolutions, as I've said before, there just isn't enough time for all of these evolutions of different kinds of eyes to have happened. It has to happen more than once. It isn't enough that an eye evolved once, but now it has to have evolved many times. And so the eye is a pretty complicated structure. We're very deeply impressed by it, but we don't realize that there is another structure in the body that is more complicated than the eye by far. And it is the basic cell in your body. And we don't even think about that because we can't even see the cells. If you rub your arm a little bit, you're going to be knocking off cells from your arm. And each one of these cells is more complicated than your eye, as complicated as the eye is. There's a whole bunch of structure in there, and this little diagram gives you a picture of the things that are in there. And so each of these cells has all of your DNA in it. It's got little molecular machines that go along and process this DNA and make proteins from it. And they go and chug along the line of the DNA and do their work on that. And there are other little machines that run along the DNA, and they do repairs to it and when it finds mistakes in it. And so it helps to correct against erroneous duplication of things, which is kind of the foundational principle of evolution, is that these erroneous things sometimes result in good things happening. And the cell fights against that. And the thing that it does that is probably the most amazing thing is that it replicates. It is alive by all definitions. It creates itself. When it grows big enough that it is able to reproduce, what it does is it kind of puts a little belt around itself that tightens, and that belt tightens off and eventually pinches it off into two cells. And that's how the cells reproduce. And so what happens inside of the cell is all these structures that you see here, they all kind of split up and they move to different ends of the cell, and this belt tightens up and creates two cells from that. So, and I won't go into all these structures, but there are some strange things inside of the cell. We have the DNA that we call our DNA, but we actually have another set of DNA, which is called the mitochondrial DNA. And that's up in the kind of top section of that cell in that picture. And so this mitochondrial DNA is another kind of DNA that only comes from your mother, unlike the regular DNA, which comes from both your father and your mother. And so for some reason, we have this mitochondrial DNA. And there's a whole bunch of other structures that you can see in there that are necessary for a cell to do all of its work and do the things that it does. So a cell, the little tiny cell, the cell you can't see, is also an extremely complex organism, and it has life in itself. It is alive. It can create itself. So summarizing all of this, the Bible says from Psalms, this is David speaking, he says, "I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." Now, David didn't understand all that we understand about the Bible now, and we are more amazing than David could have possibly understood. And that amazingness, that complexity, all of that couldn't possibly have been something that happened randomly in any period of time. And so as impressed as we are with these bodies that we have, even though they often have their flaws and weaknesses, they're pretty amazing things. But God considers these bodies to be nothing but dust. And they're just not comparable to those future spiritual bodies that he wants to get us into. So he has a plan for an even greater body than we could imagine, and that won't die as these bodies die, and will not have a lot of the imperfections, won't have any of the imperfections.